What happens when pure arrogance meets raw determination? When flash collides with substance? Tonight, witness the most shocking knockout that left an entire arena speechless. Drop A in the comments if you've ever been underestimated, and stay until the end. Trust me, you won't see this coming. He thought he had already won, until silence changed everything. The Mercedes Arena in Philadelphia buzzed with electric anticipation as 20,000 fans packed every seat, their voices creating a thunderous symphony of excitement that could be heard 3 blocks away. The bass from the sound system thumped through the concrete floors, vibrating through the soles of everyone's feet like a mechanical heartbeat. Tonight wasn't just another fight. It was supposed to be a coronation, a ceremony where a rising star would cement his place among boxing's elite by dismantling yet another opponent who dared to stand in his path. Marcus "Lightning" Rodriguez stood 6 feet 3 inches of sculpted perfection, his bronze skin gleaming under the arena lights like polished armor that had never seen real battle. Every muscle fiber told a story of privilege, of private trainers flown in from Cuba and Thailand, of supplements that cost more than most people's monthly rent, of recovery chambers and cryotherapy sessions that belonged more in a science fiction movie than a boxing gym. His record spoke volumes in the language that Vegas understood best. 37 wins, 0 losses, 28 knockouts, that had left a trail of unconscious opponents in his wake like fallen dominoes. The media had dubbed him the future of boxing, and he wore that title like a crown studded with diamonds, each victory adding another jewel to his carefully constructed image. Rodriguez shadowboxed in his corner, each movement crisp and calculated with the precision of a Swiss watch, his diamond-encrusted mouthguard catching the camera flashes like a disco ball in the spotlight. His entourage, a carefully curated collection of yes-men, Instagram models with perfect smiles and empty eyes, and hangers-on who lived vicariously through his success, surrounded him like courtiers around a king, feeding his ego with whispered promises of easy money and inevitable victory. "Easy money tonight, baby," he shouted to the crowd, his voice dripping with contempt and privilege, each word designed to remind everyone watching that they were witnessing greatness condescending to perform for their entertainment. The audience was divided like a city split by invisible battle lines. Half cheered for their golden boy, their voices raised in worship of manufactured perfection, while the other half seemed restless, hungry for something real, something authentic in a world increasingly dominated by social media personas and carefully scripted narratives. Rodriguez's trainer, a slick-haired man in an expensive Italian suit that cost more than most people's cars, whispered sweet nothings about early knockouts and easy paychecks, his words sliding off his tongue like honey laced with poison. The bookmakers had set the odds at 12-1 against his opponent, numbers that reflected not just statistical analysis, but the collective belief that this fight was nothing more than an expensive sparring session disguised as professional competition. Vegas money poured in like a waterfall during spring floods, all backing the unstoppable force that was Marcus Rodriguez, the golden boy who had never tasted defeat, never felt the sting of real adversity, never been forced to dig deep and find reserves of strength he didn't know existed. He flexed for the cameras with the practiced ease of a man who had been posing for pictures since childhood, his abs rippling like a washboard carved from marble, his smile revealing perfect veneers that cost more than a luxury car and reflected not warmth, but calculated charm. This was his kingdom, his moment, his inevitable march toward a greatness that had been purchased rather than earned, built on a foundation of carefully selected opponents and favorable matchmaking rather than the grinding, soul-crushing journey that true champions endured. The ring announcer's voice boomed across the arena like the voice of God announcing Judgment Day, Ladies and gentlemen, introducing first, fighting out of Beverly Hills, California, with a perfect record of 37 wins and 0 losses, 28 by way of knockout, the undisputed rising star of boxing, the future of the heavyweight division, Marcus "Lightning" Rodriguez. The crowd erupted in a mixture of genuine excitement and manufactured enthusiasm, their cheers creating a wall of sound that washed over Rodriguez like warm water, feeding his ego and reinforcing his belief that he was untouchable, unbeatable, and utterly destined for greatness. But beneath the surface celebration, something felt different tonight, something electric and dangerous crackling in the air like the tension before a thunderstorm. Veterans in the press section, men who had covered boxing for decades and seen every type of fighter imaginable, exchanged glances that spoke of experience and intuition, sensing something that the casual observers missed entirely. The smart money was all on Rodriguez, but the smart hearts, the ones that understood boxing's deeper truths, felt a disturbance in the force that couldn't be quantified by statistics or odds. Rodriguez danced around the ring like he owned every square inch of canvas, and in many ways he did own it through the sheer force of his presence and the weight of expectations that surrounded him like an invisible crown. His footwork was poetry in motion, each step calculated to maximize his presence and remind everyone watching that they were witnessing greatness in its purest form, uncut and unfiltered by the harsh realities that humbled lesser fighters. He threw combination after combination into the air with the fluid grace of a master conductor leading a symphony orchestra, his gloves cutting through the atmosphere with surgical precision that spoke of thousands of hours spent perfecting his craft in gyms that most fighters could never afford to enter. The sound system pumped his entrance music, a bass-heavy rap song he'd commissioned specifically for his fights, with lyrics boasting about his dominance and inevitable victory, each beat synchronized with his heartbeat, and each word reinforcing the narrative of invincibility that surrounded him like armor. Social media influencers live-streamed from ringside, their phones capturing every angle of the spectacle with the desperate hunger of people trying to capture lightning in a bottle, their followers hanging on every second of footage as if they were witnessing history in the making. Rodriguez had built his brand on being untouchable, unbeatable, and utterly confident in his superiority over every other human being who dared to step into a boxing ring with him. He'd grown up in Beverly Hills, the golden child of a real estate mogul who owned half of Malibu, and a former supermodel whose face had graced magazine covers in 3 different decades. Boxing had come naturally to him, not out of the desperate necessity that drove most fighters to the sport, but as another way to prove his superiority over the common masses who struggled for everything he'd been handed on silver platters. His amateur career had been flawless, a perfect record built on natural talent and resources that most competitors couldn't dream of accessing, winning national championships while attending elite private schools where his classmates were the children of senators and movie stars. College scouts had lined up like supplicants at a temple, offering full scholarships to Ivy League universities, but Rodriguez chose the professional route with the same casual confidence that he chose his designer suits, signing with the biggest promoters and most expensive trainers that money could buy, surrounding himself with a team that treated him like royalty and never dared to challenge his assumptions about his own greatness. He'd never known hunger in any form, not the physical hunger that drove fighters to train in freezing gyms at 5 in the morning, not the emotional hunger that came from growing up in neighborhoods where boxing was the only way out of poverty and despair, and certainly not the spiritual hunger that transformed ordinary men into warriors willing to sacrifice everything for glory. His victories came against carefully selected opponents, fighters who looked impressive on paper but had been chosen more for their ability to make Rodriguez look good than for their actual threat level. Aging veterans past their prime who were looking for one last payday before retirement, journeymen with respectable records but no real fire in their bellies, prospects who looked dangerous in highlight reels but wilted under real pressure like flowers in a desert. The media ate it up with the ravenous appetite of sharks sensing blood in the water, creating a narrative of unstoppable momentum that fed on itself and grew stronger with each carefully orchestrated victory. Magazine covers featured him in expensive suits that cost more than most people's cars, driving supercars that were worth more than most people's houses, dating celebrities whose names appeared in gossip columns and whose lives played out like reality television shows for the masses to consume. He was boxing's golden boy, the fighter who would bring the sport into the mainstream consciousness, who would make it glamorous again after years of declining pay-per-view numbers and shrinking television audiences. Corporate sponsors lined up like pilgrims seeking blessings, throwing millions of dollars at him in exchange for association with his carefully crafted image of success and invincibility. Tonight was supposed to be another carefully orchestrated step in his ascent toward a title shot, a showcase fight that would demonstrate his readiness for the championship level while entertaining the masses and generating the kind of highlights that would trend on social media for weeks. His opponent was a nobody, a last-minute replacement who'd been pulled from obscurity when the original challenger had been injured in a car accident 2 weeks before the fight. Someone the Athletic Commission had approved more out of necessity than merit. A warm body to fill the slot and collect a paycheck while Rodriguez put on a show for his adoring public. But as Rodriguez basked in the spotlight like a lizard soaking up desert sun, something began to shift in the arena's energy, a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure that only the most experienced observers could detect. The crowd's attention began to drift away from the Golden Boy's theatrical display, drawn instead toward the opposite corner, where a figure emerged from the shadows with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. Rocky Balboa stepped through the ropes with the deliberate, measured movements of someone who had fought this battle 1,000 times before. Not just in professional boxing rings around the world, but in the deeper, more meaningful arena of life itself, where victories were measured not in championships or prize money, but in the strength of character forged through adversity and tempered by time. At 48 years old, his face was a roadmap of experiences that no highlight reel could capture, each line and scar telling a story of struggle, perseverance, and the kind of wisdom that can only be earned through decades of being knocked down and getting back up again. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent training young fighters in his modest gym in South Philadelphia, passing on the lessons he'd learned through blood, sweat, and tears to a new generation of dreamers who saw in him not just a former champion, but a symbol of what was possible when heart triumphed over circumstance. Scars on his knuckles whispered stories of countless sparring sessions with hungry prospects half his age, men who came to his gym seeking to make their names by testing themselves against a legend, leaving with more respect than they'd arrived with and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a true fighter. His body wasn't sculpted like Rodriguez's masterpiece of modern athletic science. It was weathered and functional, built through decades of honest work rather than Instagram-worthy workouts, shaped by necessity rather than vanity, carrying the authentic battle scars of a man who had earned every victory through sacrifice and every defeat through lessons learned in the crucible of real competition. Rocky wore simple black trunks with Philadelphia stitched in faded gold letters across the waistband, the fabric showing signs of wear that spoke of years of use, a uniform that had seen real battles rather than photo shoots, clothing that prioritized function over fashion and substance over style. No flashy entrance music announced his arrival. No pyrotechnics or carefully choreographed light shows accompanied his walk to the ring. No entourage of beautiful people and hired enthusiasts surrounded him like a human shield against reality. Just Adrian sitting quietly in the second row, her hands clasped together in silent prayer, her eyes reflecting the love and concern of a woman who had watched her husband risk everything countless times and knew better than anyone the price that warriors pay for their courage. Beside her sat Paulie, holding a worn towel that had seen more fights than most professional boxers, its fabric stained with the sweat and blood of training sessions and actual combat. A simple piece of equipment that had become a talisman of authenticity in a sport increasingly dominated by corporate sponsorships and manufactured drama. The crowd seemed confused by the stark contrast between the two fighters, their expectations challenged by the sight of this unassuming figure who looked more like someone's father than a professional athlete. This wasn't what they'd paid premium prices to see, wasn't the spectacle that had been promised in the promotional materials and television commercials. Where was the trash talk that generated headlines and social media buzz? Where were the muscles and the bravado that looked so impressive in photographs and video packages? Where was the larger-than-life personality that modern audiences expected from their sporting heroes? Rocky moved to his corner with the fluid grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin, carrying himself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being at peace with that knowledge. He'd been out of the professional game for 3 years, content to run his small restaurant in South Philadelphia and train kids at the local gym, passing on his knowledge to young fighters who reminded him of himself at their age, hungry, determined, and willing to work harder than their more naturally gifted opponents. The call had come just 2 weeks ago, delivered by a nervous promoter who explained that the original opponent had been injured in a car accident and they desperately needed a replacement fighter who could be licensed and ready on short notice. His first instinct had been to politely decline, to explain that he had nothing left to prove to anyone, no more mountains to climb in a sport that had already given him more than he'd ever dared to dream possible when he was just another club fighter from South Philly trying to make ends meet. But then he'd seen the footage of Rodriguez in action, watched the young fighter's pre-fight interviews with growing concern, observed the arrogance and casual disrespect that seemed to pour from every word like poison from a broken container. Something stirred deep in Rocky's chest. Not anger exactly, because anger was a hot emotion that burned bright and fast, but something cooler and more enduring, a quiet recognition of what this moment required and what role he was being called to play. Sometimes he realized as he watched Rodriguez mock his previous opponents and dismiss the sport's history as irrelevant to his modern greatness. You don't fight for personal glory or financial gain or media attention. Sometimes you fight because someone needs to be taught a lesson that can only be delivered through the ancient language of combat, because certain truths can only be communicated through the fundamental honesty of two men testing their wills against each other in the most primal form of competition known to humanity. The tale of the tape that flashed on the arena's massive screens revealed a mathematical mismatch that had Las Vegas bookmakers laughing all the way to the bank and casual fans scratching their heads in confusion. Rodriguez, 6 feet 3 inches tall, 215 pounds of prime athletic specimen in the peak years of his physical development. Rocky, 5 feet 10 inches, 195 pounds of weathered veteran whose best days were supposed to be far behind him. Age 26 versus 48, a gap that represented not just years, but entirely different eras of boxing, different approaches to training, different philosophies about what it meant to be a fighter. Perfect record versus comeback story that nobody with any sense believed in. Manufactured invincibility versus earned authenticity, youth and talent versus experience and heart. As the fighters received their final instructions from the referee, a grey-haired veteran who had officiated hundreds of championship fights and seen every type of warrior the sport could produce, the contrast between the two men became even more pronounced and impossible to ignore. Rodriguez bounced on his toes with nervous energy. shadow boxing invisible opponents, talking to himself in a constant stream of consciousness designed to maintain his psychological edge, psyching himself up for what he assumed would be nothing more than elaborate target practice against a living, breathing, heavy bag. "This old man's gonna learn tonight," he muttered loud enough for the ringside microphones to capture every syllable, his words carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never been humbled by life or taught the value of respect through hard experience. "Should have stayed retired, Grandpa. Should have stayed home with your grandchildren instead of embarrassing yourself in front of all these people." His corner men laughed at his jokes like courtiers entertaining a king, feeding his ego with their sycophantic approval and reinforcing his belief that this fight was nothing more than a formality before moving on to bigger and more lucrative opportunities. Rocky stood perfectly still during this verbal assault, his breathing deep and controlled like a monk in meditation, his eyes fixed not on Rodriguez or his theatrical display, but on something beyond both of them. Perhaps the past and all the lessons it had taught him, perhaps the future and what it might hold, perhaps something transcendent that only he could perceive after decades of looking for meaning in the controlled violence of professional boxing. The referee, a man whose experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that most people missed, looked between the two fighters and seemed to understand instinctively that this wasn't going to be the easy, predictable night that everyone expected. There was something in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the obvious physical mismatch, or the betting odds, or the media narratives that had been constructed around the event. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of boxing tradition and the authority of someone who had seen every type of fight imaginable, "you've received your instructions in the dressing room. Protect yourselves at all times, obey my commands, and may the best man win." The words were ritual, repeated before every professional fight, but tonight they seemed to carry additional weight, as if the referee understood that he was about to oversee something more significant than just another boxing match. Rodriguez smirked and flexed one more time for the cameras, his muscles rippling under the bright lights like a bodybuilder posing for a magazine cover, his perfect teeth gleaming in a smile that was all surface and no substance. Rocky simply nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that somehow conveyed more dignity and purpose than all of Rodriguez's theatrical posturing, and touched his gloves together in a small ritual he'd performed before every fight for 30 years. A moment of centering that connected him to every battle he'd ever fought and every lesson he'd ever learned. The crowd's energy was split between different types of excitement, creating an unusual atmosphere that veteran observers found both fascinating and slightly unsettling. Half the audience buzzed with anticipation for the show they'd been promised in promotional materials, the spectacle of Rodriguez dismantling another opponent with surgical precision and athletic superiority. But the other half seemed to sense that something unexpected was brewing, their excitement tempered by an indefinable feeling that this fight might not unfold according to the predetermined script that everyone had accepted as inevitable. Seasoned boxing writers in the press section began to notice details that escaped the casual observers, their trained eyes picking up on subtleties that wouldn't appear in any statistical analysis or tale of the tape. They saw the way Rocky's muscles moved beneath his skin like coiled springs loaded with potential energy, the absolute stillness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had found his center and wasn't going to be moved from it by any amount of posturing or psychological warfare. They noticed how he seemed to be measuring not just his opponent, but the very air around him, calculating distances and angles with the instinctive precision of a master craftsman preparing to create his greatest work. In the VIP section, former champions and boxing legends who had been given complimentary tickets as honored guests exchanged knowing glances that spoke volumes about what they were witnessing. They'd seen that look before, that particular combination of serenity and deadly intent in the eyes of fighters who had nothing left to lose and everything to give, Warriors who had transcended the normal limitations of age and circumstance through sheer force of will and accumulated wisdom. The opening bell rang through the arena like a gunshot fired to start a revolution, its metallic tone cutting through the crowd noise and creating a moment of perfect silence before all hell broke loose. Rodriguez exploded from his corner with the fury of a man eager to make an immediate and devastating statement. His movement so explosive that several people in the front rows instinctively leaned backward as if they were witnessing a controlled detonation. His first combination was a thing of terrible beauty, a sharp jab that snapped out like a striking cobra, followed immediately by a crushing right hook that whistled through the air with enough force to decapitate a smaller man. The punches were thrown with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the power of a sledgehammer, each one designed to end the fight within the first 30 seconds and send a message to the boxing world that Marcos Rodriguez was ready for championship-level competition. But somehow, impossibly, miraculously, none of those devastating punches found their intended target. The crowd gasped in collective amazement as Rocky simply leaned back, his movement so subtle and economical that it seemed almost accidental, like a man dodging raindrops without conscious thought. Rodriguez's million-dollar right hand passed harmlessly through the space where Rocky's head had been just a fraction of a second earlier, the wind from the punch ruffling the older fighter's hair but causing no damage beyond that cosmetic disturbance. Rodriguez pressed forward with increasing desperation, throwing leather with bad intentions, each punch representing hours of training and years of accumulated skill, designed to end careers and destroy dreams with brutal efficiency. His combinations flowed like water, each technique perfect in execution and devastating in intent. The kind of punching display that had made highlight reels and established his reputation as one of the most dangerous young fighters in the sport. But somehow, impossibly, miraculously, none of them found their mark against this grey-haired ghost who moved like smoke, like water, like something that couldn't be contained or caught or conquered by conventional means. Rocky's defensive work wasn't pretty in the traditional sense. It wasn't the textbook technique they taught in expensive gyms, or the kind of flashy head movement that looked impressive in slow-motion replays. It was raw, instinctive, born from 1,000 fights in 1,000 different rings against 1,000 different styles, refined through decades of necessity and perfected through the kind of experience that couldn't be purchased or manufactured. His movements seemed to defy the laws of physics and probability, slipping punches by margins measured in millimeters, making Rodriguez look like a man trying to catch shadows with his bare hands. "Stand still, old man!" Rodriguez snarled through his mouthguard, throwing a vicious uppercut with enough force to lift Rocky off his feet if it had connected. The punch would have decapitated a smaller fighter or sent a less experienced boxer into unconsciousness. But Rocky swayed to the side at the last possible moment, letting the punch graze his shoulder harmlessly while never changing his expression or breaking his concentration. He was studying his opponent like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope, learning and cataloging every movement, every tendency, every weakness that Rodriguez revealed through his increasingly frantic attacks. In a world obsessed with flash and social media metrics, we sometimes forget that real strength isn't about the image you project. It's about the character you build when nobody's watching. Rocky Balboa didn't just knock out Marcos Rodriguez that night. He knocked out the illusion that talent without humility, skill without heart, and success without struggle can ever truly last. If this story reminded you that the quiet ones often have the most to say, drop A in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated? Share your story. I read every comment. And if this knockout left you speechless, hit that subscribe button, because there are more untold stories of heart triumphing over hype waiting for you.